switch. So I was asked to speak initially about the peace process or the impasse in the peace process. And I said, well, that's easy because there is no peace process. There never was a peace process, and there cannot be a peace process in Israel-Palestine. What do I mean by that? When we talk about a peace process, there are necessarily two or more parties that negotiate, that have some diplomatic discussion about formulating, tweaking the situation in order to arrive at an agreement. What we're dealing with in the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, if you can even call it a conflict, is something very different. What we're dealing with is the abolishing of a deeply supremacist and oppressive system. How do you abolish an oppressive system? You abolish it, you fight it, you struggle against it. Resistance for Palestinians is daily life. So I gave the name of the talk, I changed the name, and I called it by a very not catchy name, but I'm paying homage to this person, and I called it The Time for Another Man's Freedom. And this is why. In his famous and wonderful text, Martin Luther King writes from a letter from Birmingham jail. I will read this, afterwards there will be other texts that I will not read the whole thing, you don't have to bother about every word. But I would like to read this text. He says the following: I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor of the Ku Klux Klaner, meaning the KKK, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. He carries on, and I took only the important part, and then he says, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Hence the title, The Time for Another Man's Freedom. And the time is now. We are not here to dictate to the oppressed how they should oppress, and certainly not the time when they should oppress. When they should struggle against oppression. Okay, you're probably all familiar with this set of maps. It's quite useful to discuss what is happening in Palestine, but actually it is also quite misleading. Because what this map doesn't show is probably what I would regard the main issue. And if you can go to the next one. Thank you. Okay, I focused on this. You know, now it is, we're marking UN Resolution 181, the partition plan. We have to say a few things about the partition plan. There's a lot of history about it, but that's not that very important. I have two important things to say about it. One, it was very unfair. Secondly, it was never implemented. It was never ever put into practice. I know that some people think that it was, because we now have an Israeli state and something that we can call Palestinian something, but it was never implemented. Why was it never implemented? This was the plan. And I simplified it. On the right hand, in the Palestinian area, there were supposed to be roughly 700,000 Palestinians. There is actually also the Jerusalemites, which I counted in the left side. So 700,000 Palestinians on the right side. And then on the left side, you have 600,000 colonizers, mostly colonizers of Jewish descent, and 500,000 Palestinians. That was a very big problem for the Zionists, because there are two colors there. One is blue, the other is red, is green. And that goes against everything that the Zionist project is about. The Zionist project was never about that. The Zionist project was about, the next slide please, establishing an ethnically pure state. Zionism is not only a colonialist project that comes to take over, to usurp the land, to use the resources of the land, etc., etc. It is also inherently about exclusivity. It is also inherently about establishing a state for them and only for them. And having these two colors on the map doesn't make any sense for the Zionists. It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense today, to any of them, with no exception. What happened, in fact, has nothing to do with UN Resolution 181, which actually safeguarded the rights of all the people who were supposed to live in that so-called Jewish state. Even the Balfour Declaration, which was established by the outspoken anti-Semite Balfour, even that safeguarded the rights of all the people of that land. But anyway, these never materialized. What materialized is this. We will not go into it, but I'm taking the left part from the UN report on Israeli apartheid, an excellent report written by Killian Falk, and from the right side, this is from Visualizing Palestine, which basically says the exact same thing. What we have since 48 to this day is a multiverse of states, a multi-state solution, where it all depends on what ethnicity you have and which geographic location you're in. So going back to the previous map, it doesn't say the whole, it doesn't tell us the whole story because it's only about the land. But the issue is not about land, it's about which kind of people live on that land. What's the ethnicity of the people living on that land? And for the Zionists, they wanted to have what they call a Jewish and democratic state. It's not a logical term. Israel, by the way, is not Jewish and not democratic. It is vehemently opposed to Jewish values, and it is certainly vehemently opposed to democratic values. But for them, we can move on to forward. For them, for the Zionists, what they wanted to have back then, and what they want to have to this day, what they call a Jewish and democratic state is, if we control the population, if we have our kind of people, then we can claim that we are a democracy. First and foremost, they had to create a so-called Jewish majority by driving away the indigenous people from their land. The very next thing that they had to do is to create a system of control, which neatly falls under the definition of the crime of apartheid, which makes sure that those who have been expelled will never be allowed to come back, and those who remain on their land will never be allowed equal rights. That's what it's about. This is what we're struggling against. The rest are just details. Abolishing this deeply racist and supremacist and oppressive system is about fighting it. It's about struggling against it. There's no other way around it. It has nothing to do with the peace process. So I just want to give you two quick examples. I know we haven't got much time. What does that mean? What is this Jewish and democratic state that I'm talking about? So one example is from the Zionist right spectrum, and the other is from the so-called left spectrum of the Zionist thinking. So we have famous Benny Morris, historian, who uncovered much of the crimes of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but as far as morals go, he doesn't have a problem with that. He says, yes, there was an ethnic cleansing, but that's a good thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have our cherished supremacist state. Otherwise, we will not be a so-called Jewish majority in our land. And if we will not be a Jewish majority, there will be no reason for that place to exist at all. Actually, he carries on. So the first part, he says it was necessary to uproot the Palestinians. And then the next thing he says, because he's right-wing, he doesn't try to come across as a liberal. At least he's honest about his racism. What he says is, actually, Ben-Gurion's greatest mistake is that he hasn't finished the job. That there are still Palestinians left in Palestine. If he had totally cleansed the land of Palestinians, then the problem would be solved. That's what Benny Morris is saying. The next version of Jewish and democratic comes from this so-called leftist, so-called peacenik, Ami Ayalon. Actually, he has a Museiba Ayalon peace initiative under his name. And he says the following, more or less. He says, if we are not the majority in our land, we don't have a right to dictate anything. And this is existential for us. We must be the majority because we must have the right to dictate. He says, this is why it is a condition for us to see a Palestinian state. Not because they deserve it, not because we like them, because it is existential for us. The only way for us to maintain the so-called Jewish democratic state is to make sure that as many of them live on the other side of the fence, on the other side of the border. And you can call it a state, you can call it an autonomy, you can call it whatever you want. But that's what it's about. And that's what every single liberal Zionist thinks, with no exception. And then he carries on and he says, actually, we don't even need a Palestinian partner. We have enough military power to do it, to force a Palestinian state on them. And he carries on by saying, obviously we have our red lines. For example, the very first thing that he mentions is no Palestinian should be allowed to come back to our so-called Jewish state. That's the other form of peace that we are dealing with. And these are the only forms, actually, of peace that are being offered by the Zionists. And then again, what does it matter? What does it matter what forms of peace the Zionists offer to the Palestinians? The question is not what these people offer. The question is, how do we end that system of oppression? I'm happy to say that we do have a way to end it. Can we move on to the next slide? I just wanted to make it clear, if it wasn't clear until now, what we are dealing with. This lady, Prime Minister of the State of Israel, in 1970 they were discussing, it's a very interesting talk that they had in the parliament. They were discussing many things, but also the issue of mixed marriages. Jews marrying non-Jews in Israel. Very scary concept. And then she said, this is something that is worrying. She says, it is perhaps our first duty after state security and linked to it. It is worth it, regretfully, to pay any price. What is she talking about? Mixed marriages. We have to avoid to make sure that Jews do not marry non-Jews in Israel. And she looks at it as a matter of state security. I know there is no guarantee that a Jew will remain a Jew and that his children and grandchildren will remain Jewish if they are not in Israel. Therefore, we need to have this state that is about ethnic purity to make sure that they do not breed among the others. I consider this the most important thing with a capital P. Without this, nothing else matters. This is a very long text and I shortened it, but she also compares mixed marriages, Jews marrying non-Jews, with another horrible thing that happened before, and she compares this to the Holocaust. She says, we already passed the Holocaust, we don't need another Holocaust, referring to Jews marrying non-Jews. That's the type of thinking of these people. That's what we are dealing with. Next slide, please. Finally, and I will end here, I can give you many examples of why Israel is an apartheid state. An apartheid state by design from its very inception. One very important issue to discuss is what, in one way, we can talk about what is regarded as Jewish nationality in Israel. You see, I am a privileged Israeli Jew. It's not the way I define myself, it's the way the state defines me. Meaning that I have an Israeli citizenship, but I don't have an Israeli nationality because there is no such thing. My nationality, according to the state, is Jewish. My neighbor in Jaffa, who will also be an Israeli citizen, their nationality would be Arab, for example, or Druze, or Circassian. By law, from the very beginning, there is this type of discrimination between the Übermenschen and the Untermenschen, the superhumans and the subhumans. This is how the state was founded. First of all, by driving away the indigenous population. Second of all, by making sure that there will never be the possibility for equality between people of different ethnicities. And it is so absurd that there are actually two different citizenship laws. One is the way that Jewish people receive citizenship, and this is done under the law of return. Even if they are born in Israel, they will get their citizenship based on the law of return. They haven't returned anywhere, they were born there, but they will get citizenship under that law. And this is a direct quote from the Israeli embassy underneath, where they approve what I just said. And the other way to get citizenship is if you are not Jewish. And then you get citizenship by residence. and it is much more complicated, it is not that straightforward, etc. In fact, Jews around the world can gain citizenship in Israel tomorrow, even if they have no connection to the land, even if they have never been there. And by law, it is stated that all the Jews around the world, all the world Jewry, are potential citizens of the state. They just don't know about it. They're citizens, they just didn't implement it yet. If we go into other laws, I can show you the same thing regarding other things, like land ownership or water and so on. It's all about that. It's all about guarding the land, guarding the resources from the others. This issue about us versus them. We have to guard the land, we have to guard the resources, we have to do everything in order to make sure that this is ours and not theirs. To make sure that we are the majority and not allow anyone else back. How do we struggle against that? In order to struggle against that, I'm very happy to say that there is a very successful tool that we have, which is the BDS campaign, that was initiated in 2005 by a representative group of Palestinian civil society, over 170 different civil society organizations, are calling on us, conscientious people around the world and conscientious Israelis, few, maybe more in the future, to stand up for Palestinian rights and to demand that all the people of that land will have full equality, freedom and justice for all. And when I'm talking about all people, I'm talking about all 18 million people, 6 million who are among the privileged Israeli Jews, and 12 million Palestinians, half of which are in forced exile for the past 7 decades. All of these people have to be incorporated in this new plan. And then we can decide about how to dissect the land, maybe if you want, to 1 or 2 or 5 states. But all these 18 million people need to have their rights. And we, especially myself, cannot dictate for the oppressed how and when to struggle. So indeed, the time for another man's freedom is now. Thank you.